Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here speaking with Sasa Aakil.
Hi, my name is Sasa Aakil. So I am a poet and a visual artist and the Youth Poet Laureate of Montgomery County. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you, Ethan. I think this is a great initiative to be trying to provide these resources for young poets. So I'm just really glad to be here, and I hope I can share some useful things.
Glad you're here with us today, and we can get straight into the questions. So one question I think I ask everyone is, how did you first get into poetry? And all the intricacies of that, whether that's through someone or it's through a certain medium or information source, just anything you can give us about that.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because I think I got into words before I got into poetry, which I say because as a kid, I realized that I liked words and I had a way with words and I loved like looking through the dictionary. But I didn't really get into poetry and writing. I didn't really realize that was a thing until I was 9 years old. And I'm 18, by the way, so 9 years ago. I was 9 years old, and my mom, I was homeschooled my entire life, but my mom decided that she was going to teach me a unit about poetry. And I really, really, really took to it, and I loved it. And it was really interesting because I'd never really seen this kind of the different forms of poetry and the different meters and all of that stuff. I've never seen a word where that mattered. So for me, that was really cool. And I loved it so much that my mom actually decided that she would do a second poetry unit because she noticed that I was good at it. And of course, I loved it. So that kind of like was the springboard. And so I always give her credit for being like the reason I write today. Because that was how I realized that I liked it and then got into doing it more and more and more. I started filling up like journals. Like every few months, I would need a new journal. And my journey kind of moved from there.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's definitely value to recognizing the people in your life who can encourage you to write poetry. And even though, of course, we'd hope that everyone can have teachers and guardian figures who can do that for them, I think there's also like hopefully other ways in which people can try to find poetry as well. And something I wanted to follow up on with that is, over time, I'm sure this has changed. And so you can kind of walk us through how that has happened or what the subjects of those changes might be. But how have the themes you explore and the messages you try to express in your poetry changed over time, do you think?
It's very interesting. My poetry, I feel like the message hasn't fully changed because the things that I write about still apply today. So one of the main reasons I started writing was because it was a way for me to express a lot of pent up frustration that I had about living in a world that didn't necessarily and often did the exact opposite of supporting my people and my identity. So I realized at a very young age that I was of a background that this country, this infrastructure, and this place actively tries to make not exist. And so I wrote a lot of poetry about being Black in America and being young and being a female, being a girl, and being a Muslim and what all of that meant together. And so a lot of the issues that affected me back then when I was 9 years old, 9 years ago, still affect me today and still affect my people today. So in a lot of ways, my themes haven't changed, but also in a lot of ways they have, because through my journey of writing and expressing those frustrations, I also learned the value and like the beauty in simply writing about joy and like the color of the sky and all of these things that we act as if it's a privilege to write about. But of course, we still need to write about them, even though we are writers of color and we have all these other frustrations to discuss. We still need to write about how beautiful the world is and our cultures are and just appreciate the things around us. So I think the main way my themes have changed from when I was young is that there's less of that frustration and there's more of acknowledging and celebrating the beauty that is around in in my world, and then even using that as a mode to address the things that make the world less beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an indication of like a maturation of the work, because it's like you're able to kind of at least, no matter how important a fixation is, you want to at least develop around that fixation and not necessarily stay there, because the staticness of it is what kind of gets to you over time. And so I definitely
Yeah,
think it's a good idea to, branch out in whatever way you think is fit.
yeah,
And
we'll
something
try at
else,
least.
yeah, definitely. And something I wanted to continue on is, what do you think a young writer who is experiencing these kinds of frustrations that you're talking about, who has those same kind of emotions pent up, what do you think they could do to, uh, first of all, like further their poetry as activism, or second of all, get more involved in community in general through some kind of vector using poetry?
Well, I think one of the um, best ways to get involved in a poetry community, I'm going to do a little bit of a plug here. Well, in general, it's just to find your local organizations, like find whatever local poetry organizations are around you. One of the good ways to do that is to submit to different competitions, like the Scholastic Arts and Writing Awards. That's my little plug. I know it's kind of like on the nose, but it is, because you end up finding like the organization that's in charge of judging your region or that kind of thing, and you get in contact with these different people. So for me, I discovered Writopia Lab, and I was like, oh, this is very cool. And even though I didn't necessarily get involved with that space, I realized that space was like it existed. And I got involved with other local arts and writing associations and programs and things that I could do after school, although after class, because I never actually went to school. And even during my classes and things that I could do during the day. So the best thing to do is just put yourself out there, which is really, really, really hard. I know, I understand, young artists, young poets, really difficult, but you have to put yourself and your work out in the world. Another thing that I did, I started writing again 9 years ago. So Google Plus was still a thing. You remember that,
Yeah,
Ethan?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's like this short stint of time where that was the thing. I don't remember what
Yeah.
happened to it.
Yeah, it kind of faded into obscurity. But I started posting my poetry on Google Plus when I was like, I don't know, 12, 13. I don't know how old I was. But that was the space in which I realized that my words had impact, and like people actually liked the things I was writing, even though they were not good. But to this day, that is the first place I remember experiencing like, oh, wow, this is my work, my words matter. And so being able to put yourself in a space like that, even if you're just sharing like on Instagram or you're sharing with your family, putting yourself in a space where you'll realize that your words have a weight and a meaning is the first step to getting yourself out into the art organizations in the world, because it does require an opening that can be difficult and can be scary, but it's also amazing. So submit to art competitions and find other writers in your area and clubs at school and stuff like that. That's my answer.
Yeah, I mean, there's two big parts to that, which I've also had experience with. I think one is like the whole competition aspect of it. I was very fortunate in that like I didn't really have to think too much about like getting outside of the Scholastic thing until like I already got relatively far with it. But like the thing about Scholastic and the thing I really like about Scholastic is that it gives you regional awards and not just necessarily like it's not like one award for the entire country and like one person gets it.
Mm-hmm.
Because like the whole thing I think with submitting to writing competitions is that feeling like a high barrier of entry to the point where it's like I need to be like literally top five or like poets of all
Yeah.
time just to like even have a chance of winning or whatever. But it's like if you
Mm-hmm.
have something local, regional like Scholastic, then it feels much more accessible, right? And also
Mm-hmm.
I definitely want to tag on to that and say that there's going to be a lot of local competitions. Like libraries hold them. I know I
Yeah.
did one when I was a kid, like an essay competition for the local library. You should ask your teachers, definitely ask your teachers, because they know the most about like
Mm-hmm.
your school, your local school district or whatever, if especially if you like go to a public school. And so like all that kind of stuff definitely matters. And the second thing
Exactly.
I wanted to touch, oh sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, you finish and then I'll go.
Okay. The second thing I wanted to touch on is just when you were talking about how to like kind of, oh shoot, I'm like losing my trail of thought now. But I think it was when you were talking about how to like get into a community of writers. I think it's really important to find other people who also like to write and are supportive, most importantly, because like
Mm-hmm.
you also want to be careful. I guess this is just I got my hands burned a little when I was a little younger, like sharing poetry with people who didn't really care that much about it. Then you get kind of like discouraged or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But like even if that's true,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, find people who care about it and just keep in mind that like at least it matters to you, right?
Exactly. I was going to ask, do you mind if I share some poetry organizations that are actually local in the DC, Maryland area?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so one poetry organization, well, actually, hip hop culture organization that really was like the springboard for my entrance into the art scene in DC, is Words Beats and Life. And so that's an organization, Words Beats and Life.inc Inc. And if you look it up, you can find their website, and they offer classes around like poetry writing and spoken word. And then they also do like beat production, a bunch of other cool stuff, MC classes. So that's a really good place to start for young artists who wants to get themselves out there. Also, Split This Rock is a local organization, and they specifically work on poetry and poetry writing and performance. So they take like a group of kids to Brave New Voices, and they do all of that. It's very cool. Another great one that I had mentioned before was Writopia Lab. So they do all kinds of writing. They do poetry and playwriting and short fictions and like all of that. They do all kinds of writing. So if you're also looking into getting into other kinds of writing, there is also Writopia Labs in DC. So I live right outside of DC in a small town called Wheaton. So that's a lot of the places I'll be referencing, but there are countless like organizations, and if you really like look for them, you'll find them because they're gems. And
Yeah,
that's it.
definitely. I think you can apply that kind of a mindset to like no matter where you live. It doesn't have to necessarily be like the DC area for sure. I know that if you look around my area, there's like with Houston, there's lots of great little like smaller points, and especially the way I've grown up on it, it's like school districts, small like local libraries and stuff like that. So those are also options for sure. And one question that I kind of wanted to, sorry, one question I wanted to close off with before we get into the poem reading is I wanted to ask you, which is when you're like writing poetry, I know it's very difficult to explain, but kind of give a little bit of an insight of what you think about when you're like writing each line, when you like come up with phrases and stuff like that. Like, do they pop into your head? Do you like painstakingly craft them, or what kind of happens? And at a very general level, of course.
Okay, so most generally, I like to say that I've been writing poetry so long that I think in poetry. So, sometimes when you have like a second language, you know it really well, you think in that language, and sometimes you think in your first language, and it's both of them. That's kind of how my brain works. So I'll be looking at the sky and I'll be like, what a beautiful sky. And I'll just come up with this random line of poetry, but it's just like kind of what happens in my head. So to answer the part about just coming up with like these flowery phrases and stuff, that is a lot of the way it happens. Like for me, I keep a document on my phone, and I keep a journal, and I have this like whole category called bits and pieces, and these are just random lines of poetry that pop into my head on a regular day. And so a lot of my process comes from pulling those lines that I come up with randomly, through being inspired by the world and its beauty and its injustices as well, and putting those into like putting down into a page onto a page into an actual poem. And I think while I'm writing, I just try to come up with the most efficient and I guess most beautiful way to say exactly what I'm thinking. A big thing for me, a theme in my life in general, but especially in my writing, is honesty. I feel like it can be hard to tell the truth, but I feel like it's even harder to write it down. So what I try my very, very best to do is write with the most honesty, but also come at the truth in a very tactful manner, in a very like fancy flowery manner. And sometimes poetry isn't always flowery and layered, but I leave room for those kinds of poems, but I also leave room for poems that have fun things in them, like the ruffles and the dress looks like the petals of the flower or something like that.
Yeah.
Fancy nice things.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think there's a lot in there that I've done too, like keeping bits and pieces. I mean, something bad I used to do is like, I just never wrote anything down if I like thought of it. So I'd have to like repeat it in my head until I got home so I could like actually write it down. But yeah.
Yes, I can relate to that.
Yeah. If you're ready, we can go ahead with the
cool.
poem reading now.
Okay. So this is a poem I wrote a while back. Oh, I also should have mentioned prompts are a good way to write poetry because they force you to think in specific ways. So this is a poem I wrote maybe in April, which coincidentally is Poetry Month. And it was one of the most convoluted, longest prompts I ever received in my life from this amazing poet and teaching artist named Pages Matham. But it was a ridiculous prompt that maybe was made up of 6 pieces. And it kind of became one poem, which I think very much embodies and tells a story of who I am. And so this poem is called Here I Am. Here I am, standing in front of you, wishing my fingers could move faster across your fretboards, wishing my fingers fit more comfortably on the edge of this pickup, I swear. You've been a part of me since that time I found that the roundest sounds echo through the chest as if we are both instruments. I had not the space for you then, so I tucked your name away. Held it quiet until the day I saw you and could no longer deny these days. My fingers smell like metal strings and machine heads. And I smile because I never known an art like this. I'm not all too good but at an art like this, but I smile because my first love was the sea. As deep as these bass tones, they seem confused when they see this Black Muslim girl with a guitar strapped to her back, as if they expected me to go quietly through this world they've built, as if they expect me to leave my bass amp and vocal cords on mute, but nah. We turn up and recite the names of everyone we've lost. I think of Brianna when I strum a B note, second fret on the A string, first chord of my heart, for we are both instruments, for they are a part of me and you are a part of me, and we do not forget. Their names, your name, and this life, it's taught me that the sin I've known ain't even sin, that there is no paradox in a Black Muslim girl with a bass, a pen, clay, and acrylics. These frets were made for ink-stained hands, hands in prayer, hands in salutes. Don't shoot, I believe in God, memorial, and music. Power, prayer, Blackness, and this be worship. Here I am, playing songs of revolution on a blue bass named Ocean, reflecting on sound and sea waves. Counting tempos, counting names, 1, 2, 3, 4, Emmett, John, Brianna, George. I wish for a world in which they are still living. I wish for a world in which my love for you and skill are the same. I wish for a world in which all people walk fully aware of their own heartbeats, knowing that we are all instruments. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. I think a lot of the vocal elements really come out when you're reading them, and I like that a lot.
Thank you. Yes, I stumbled a couple times. We're not going to talk about that.
No problem. Do you have any closing remarks for any like young poets or anything before we close out?
No, I don't know. I guess yes. Maybe I want all young poets out there to know that poetry is a tool and it is a gift and it is something that you can take for yourself and own it in whatever way you see fit. It doesn't have to be the way the world tells you it should be. It doesn't have to sound like Shakespeare. It doesn't have to sound like Saul Williams. It can be whatever you think it is. And just use it as your tool to build and create and change your world, because it is your world, and so it's your oyster, even though that's really corny. But poetry is just an amazing tool for processing life and changing things. So take it, accept it, and invest in it, because it will serve you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.